Imagine enjoying a peaceful afternoon at home, only to find the HOA's most relentless enforcer banging on your door, demanding to let her son use your private basketball court. When you refuse, she does the unthinkable. She calls 911. I'm Alex Carter, and today's story is one you won't believe. An HOA Karen who twisted community rules to get her way, igniting a battle that shook our neighborhood and tested my patience like never before. It started on a breezy Saturday morning. I had just finished renovating a small private basketball court in my backyard. For years, I'd dreamed of having a space to shoot hoops, stay fit, and occasionally invite friends over for a casual game. I'd followed all the HOA guidelines, obtained the proper permits, made sure the design fit the neighborhood's aesthetic, and double-checked the noise ordinances. Everything was by the book, but apparently, not everyone was thrilled. Karen, our self-proclaimed HOA watchdog, showed up within an hour of my first shot, demanding to know if her teenage son could use our basketball court. When I politely reminded her it was private property, she huffed and insisted that anything in her neighborhood was fair game. Before I knew it, she was threatening to file complaints, revoke my permits, and, most shocking of all, call the police. Stay tuned, because what began as a simple refusal to share a private amenity spiraled into an all-out confrontation, revealing just how far an overzealous HOA president would go to assert her power. And trust me, things only got crazier when 911 was actually dialed. Our neighborhood boasts pristine lawns, tidy flower beds, and a reputation for zero tolerance when it comes to anything that bends the rules. Karen, the iron-fisted enforcer of the HOA, sees every small deviation as a personal affront. Residents have whispered for years about how she runs the board with an iron hand, ruling on everything from mailbox heights to permissible garage paint colors. When I decided to install a private basketball court in my backyard, I jumped through every hoop the HOA set. I hired a licensed contractor, secured the necessary permits, and even presented my design plan to the board to ensure it matched the required guidelines. Surprisingly, I got the green light. No official objections, no warnings of potential issues. At first, everything went smoothly. The court was completed without incident, and I spent the first couple of days casually shooting hoops. Neighbors peered over fences, some even offering compliments on how neat it looked. But on the third day, Karen marched up, arms folded and eyes blazing. She explained that her teenage son was an aspiring basketball star, and she felt it was only fair he have access to any sports facility in the neighborhood. I tried to keep the conversation civil, mentioning that while the community does have shared amenities like a public park, my backyard court wasn't part of those public spaces. She wouldn't hear it. Within minutes, Karen's tone shifted from demanding to outright hostile. She threatened that if I didn't allow her son free rein on my private court, she'd make sure the HOA found 100 reasons to fine me. Little did I know, her threats were just the beginning of a saga that would soon involve official complaints, legal gray areas, and eventually, a 911 call I never saw coming. The morning after Karen's ominous visit, I woke up to an orange violation notice pinned to my fence. It cited unauthorized recreational structure, claiming my court hadn't been approved by the HOA, despite my having official paperwork. Frustrated, I gathered my permits and receipts, determined to prove my compliance. Later that afternoon, I attended the HOA's weekly open forum to address this sudden violation notice. As expected, Karen was there, presiding over the meeting like a hawk. When it was my turn to speak, I calmly presented the documents showing that I'd jumped through every administrative hoop. Several neighbors backed me up, having seen the court's construction progress over the weeks. But Karen countered with a new angle. Private courts caused noise pollution and posed a safety risk. She quoted random sections of the HOA handbook, though none truly applied. The more she tried to twist the rules, the more apparent it became that this was personal. The board, somewhat embarrassed, decided to table the issue, promising they'd look into it more closely. That evening, I returned home to find Karen's teenage son shooting baskets on my court without permission, hoops echoing loudly across the yard. When I asked him to leave, he smirked and said, "My mum said it's okay for me to be here." Moments later, Karen herself appeared, raging that I had no right to expel her son from my property. Our shouting match ended, with her threatening to escalate the matter to the highest authorities. Little did I suspect that her idea of highest authorities would mean calling 911 for what she would label trespassing and harassment on my own land. My heart nearly stopped when the flashing red and blue lights pulled up in front of my house that same night. I peered out the window to see 2 patrol cars, and Karen was standing there, phone in hand, gesturing wildly toward my private court. Her son hovered by her side, clearly uncomfortable but not daring to defy his mother. The moment I stepped outside, the officers approached me with stern expressions. Karen began ranting about how I'd assaulted her son and illegally prevented him from using the basketball court. I held my tongue, aware that any misstep could escalate the situation. When the officers asked for my account, I calmly explained that this was my private property, built with the HOA's approval, and that Karen's son had trespassed. I showed them the boundary lines, the relevant permits, and even some texts from supportive neighbors who saw her son jump the fence earlier. It was at that point the officers exchanged glances. They realized this was not a criminal matter, but more likely a civil dispute fueled by Karen's sense of entitlement. One officer quietly asked Karen if she truly wanted to press charges. She hesitated, then insisted she did. But after reviewing my documentation and talking to witnesses, the officers gently informed Karen there were no grounds for an arrest. That twist, her attempt to weaponize 911 against me, was just the start of a more elaborate game Karen was planning. News of Karen's 911 call spread through our neighborhood like wildfire. Social media groups lit up with debates about whether her actions were justified or completely out of line. Most neighbors were shocked that she'd call the cops over a private basketball court, while a few defended her, suggesting that maybe I'd been too exclusive. I started getting texts from neighbors offering support, some sharing their own run-ins with Karen's authoritarian approach. One dad admitted he'd stopped letting his kids play in the neighborhood playground because Karen had repeatedly harassed them for being too loud. Another resident confessed that he'd paid a hefty fine for a porch violation that never existed, just to avoid further conflict. The neighborhood divided into 2 camps, those tired of Karen's intimidation tactics and those who dreaded crossing her, fearing random fines or official-sounding notices. Meanwhile, Karen basked in the attention, claiming she was only trying to maintain community standards. Still, no one could ignore that she'd pulled an extreme move by dialing 911 for a non-emergency. Some neighbors approached me, suggesting we collectively address the HOA board about her abuses of power. Yet, Karen's iron grip on the HOA made many reluctant to speak up. This swelling tension indicated a larger confrontation was imminent, one that would go beyond my private basketball court and question Karen's entire reign as the self-appointed ruler of the neighborhood. Curious about Karen's motives, I began looking into her background with the HOA. Through some quiet conversations and a bit of online research, I discovered she'd joined the board years ago as a stickler for the rules, but had gradually amassed more influence. Rumor had it she loved the control, being able to dictate the smallest aspects of everyone's lives, from holiday decorations to the number of cars in a driveway. A neighbor named Lisa confided that Karen's son had once been caught vandalizing community property, but never faced consequences due to Karen's position. Lisa suspected Karen's push to use my private court was part of her son's rehabilitation, or so Karen liked to describe it. But to me, it looked more like an attempt to leverage her HOA power to get personal benefits. On top of that, new anonymous complaints started showing up in my mailbox, accusing me of excessive noise during the day, suspicious gatherings, and even improper maintenance of my yard. I had a feeling these complaints all led back to Karen, trying to pile up violations until I'd be forced to comply with her demands or pay through the nose. It was a pattern that suggested Karen was escalating the conflict. Between the random complaints and her willingness to involve law enforcement, it became clear we were heading toward a showdown, and if I wanted to protect my property rights and my sanity, I'd have to gather evidence, ally with supportive neighbors, and confront the HOA directly. The emotional toll began to show. I'd built the basketball court not just for myself, but to share with friends and family who visited. Now, each bounce of the ball felt tainted by the risk of Karen swooping in, phone at the ready to call the cops again. My stress mounted as I weighed the possibility of more false accusations. Meanwhile, other neighbors privately approached me, sharing their own stories. One single mom confided that Karen had filed a noise complaint against her teenage daughter's small birthday party. leading to a hefty fine and a humiliating disciplinary hearing. Another resident told me how Karen demanded to see his dog's registration papers, threatening him with removal of his unapproved pet. Despite the frustration, I was torn. Part of me wanted to keep the peace, even if it meant occasionally letting Karen's son shoot hoops, but doing so felt like surrendering my rights and validating Karen's bullying tactics. The guilt weighed heavily. Was I escalating tensions by refusing or simply defending what was mine? Amid these dilemmas, I tried to maintain calm. Deep down, I believed that if Karen could be reasoned with, or if the HOA board saw the bigger picture, we might resolve this peacefully. But each new story of her harassment made me question if that was even possible. We were fast approaching a point where passive acceptance would only invite more intimidation. A line had to be drawn, and the entire neighborhood would soon have to choose sides. Late one night, I received an anonymous tip via text. Karen plans to push a motion at the next HOA meeting that will label your court a nuisance structure. Show up prepared. Alarmed, I reached out to supportive neighbors, urging them to attend the upcoming session. As word spread, rumors surfaced that Karen had been bragging about having a surefire way to get my court dismantled. Adding to the intrigue, a local journalist who specialized in covering odd community disputes caught wind of the 911 incident. She reached out, curious to interview me and possibly Karen. I hesitated. Media attention could help or hurt my case, but I couldn't ignore the potential public support that might arise if the truth came out. At the same time, evidence began to surface that Karen was behind a number of exaggerated or downright fabricated complaints in other neighborhoods she'd once influenced. If those allegations were true, it meant she had a track record of using official channels for personal vendettas. The tension was palpable. Every passing day felt like walking on eggshells, anticipating the next surprise complaint or confrontation. The upcoming HOA meeting loomed large. Everyone I spoke with sensed a climax was near. Karen was clearly determined to remove any obstacle to her son's free usage of the court, and I braced myself for a battle that would test our community's resolve like never before. In the days leading up to the meeting, I connected with a small group of neighbors, some of whom had clashed with Karen over petty issues, others who simply believed in fairness. We shared documents, messages, and violation notices that revealed a disturbing pattern. Karen would systematically target those who disagreed with her. She'd manipulate HOA bylaws, twist the wording of rules, and threaten legal action at the slightest hint of defiance. One neighbor, a retired attorney named Mr. Blake, offered to review our documents and provide insight on possible legal routes. He discovered multiple irregularities in Karen's approach, fines imposed without proper process, claims of disruption never backed by evidence, and even attempts to override decisions made by other HOA board members. It was a goldmine of potential defenses if she tried to brand my court as a nuisance. Meanwhile, I learned that Karen's son, ironically, had been bragging to friends about how his mum could force anyone to let him play wherever he wanted. This only fueled community frustration. The basketball court fiasco symbolized a much bigger problem: unchecked power in the hands of someone who believed she was above the very rules she enforced. Our growing alliance decided to present a unified front at the meeting. We prepared statements, organized evidence into neat folders, and even set up a private group chat for real-time coordination. The sense of camaraderie was unmistakable. People were tired of living in fear of Karen's next move. On the day of the HOA meeting, the community center buzzed with tension. Rows of seats filled quickly, and an air of expectancy gripped everyone. Karen arrived with her son in tow, head held high, as though she were orchestrating a triumphant spectacle. When the meeting was called to order, she immediately placed an urgent motion on the table: the classification of my basketball court as a nuisance structure. She claimed it generated excessive noise and undermined the neighborhood's harmony. With a dramatic flourish, she pointed to a stack of alleged complaints, many of which were suspiciously anonymous. I took the podium next, armed with my permits, noise level logs, and a stack of supportive testimonials from neighbors who had never heard a peep from my court during the day. One by one, allies stepped forward, recounting how Karen had harassed them over trivial matters, forging patterns of intimidation. A hush fell over the room as Mr. Blake, the retired attorney, dissected Karen's motion. He highlighted inconsistencies in the bylaw changes she cited, and even challenged the authenticity of some complaint signatures. The pressure escalated as more residents demanded to know why Karen had called 911 for a non-issue, risking police resources for personal gain. In that moment, it became evident that the community was no longer willing to sit quietly. We'd reached a critical turning point. Either Karen's motion would pass, or the facade of her authority would crumble before everyone's eyes. The meeting erupted into chaos when Karen, furious that her motion faced so much opposition, slammed her gavel on the table. She singled me out, voice quivering with anger. "You've turned this entire neighborhood against me with your lies." As she advanced toward me, I stood my ground, reminding her calmly that every piece of evidence I'd provided was legitimate and verifiable. In that electrifying moment, someone in the audience began to film. Karen's teenage son hung back, visibly embarrassed, while she raised her voice. "My son deserves a place to play. It's not fair you have a basketball court and won't let him use it." Her words, laced with entitlement, drew gasps from the crowd. I responded in a measured tone. "I have no issue with kids playing basketball, but this is private property. You can't force me to share it, especially not by calling the cops." My statement triggered a wave of murmurs. Neighbors who had remained neutral suddenly realized the extent of her overreach. Karen's face reddened. In a last-ditch effort, she accused me of ruining the community spirit and excluding families. But Mr. Blake interjected, pointing out that public recreational facilities existed for everyone. My court was never part of those amenities. With the cameras rolling and the crowd watching, Karen found herself cornered. The tension reached a boiling point, setting the stage for a decisive outcome. Either her authority would smash my rights, or the community would finally rise to strip her of her undeserved power. Silence engulfed the hall as everyone awaited the HOA board's verdict on Karen's motion. Each passing second felt like a drumbeat, amplifying the intensity. Karen, now visibly shaken, clutched her so-called complaints while shooting me icy glares. Even her staunchest supporters seemed uneasy under the weight of undeniable evidence stacked against her tactics. Suddenly, a fellow board member cleared his throat. "We've examined the documents Mr. Blake has presented, along with the evidence Alex and the other neighbors provided. There are inconsistencies that we cannot ignore." The murmurs grew louder, with several neighbors nodding in agreement. Karen tried to interject, but another board member shut her down, emphasizing that they had a duty to uphold fair standards, not personal vendettas. This frank admission hinted that even some on the board were fed up with her heavy-handed ways. The stage was set for the final confrontation. Would the board vote to declare my court a nuisance and let Karen effectively bully me into compliance? Or would they acknowledge the overwhelming proof of her overreach and finally stand up to her? In that charged atmosphere, I felt a sense of solidarity with my neighbors, many of whom had braved Karen's wrath before. Whatever happened next, it was clear we wouldn't back down. We were on the brink of a climax that would determine the fate of my basketball court and signal whether our community would reclaim its voice or remain under Karen's thumb. The board chair stood to address the room, and you could almost hear everyone holding their breath. "After reviewing all evidence and listening to statements from both sides," he began slowly, "we find that the motion to classify this basketball court as a nuisance structure is unfounded." He paused for effect, his gaze shifting to Karen. "Moreover, the manner in which complaints have been filed and certain rules applied raises serious concerns about fair governance." A ripple of relief and applause washed through the room. Karen's expression shifted from anger to shock, her mouth opening as though to protest. Before she could speak, another board member stepped in. "We also can't condone calling 911 for non-emergencies," she said pointedly. "This not only wastes police resources, but also undermines genuine safety concerns in the community." Karen's teenage son stared at the floor, no longer the confident boy who had been sneaking onto my court. Realizing the tide had turned, Karen tried one final tactic. "You're all ignoring the bigger picture. We need unity, not division." But it fell flat. Residents swiftly reminded her that unity can't be built on intimidation. The board then delivered a final blow, an announcement that they would conduct a thorough review of Karen's previous complaints, including fines and violations she had levied. If found improper, they'd be overturned, and Karen could face penalties or removal from her position. Cheers erupted, and for the first time in ages, it felt like the neighborhood had collectively stood up against fear. My basketball court remained right where it belonged, my private property, and Karen's reign was effectively shattered. In the days that followed, the atmosphere around our neighborhood shifted noticeably. The dreaded feeling of stepping outside and wondering what rule Karen might wield next began to dissolve. Neighbors openly congratulated me on standing firm. More importantly, they praised the collective stand we had all taken. A sense of renewed camaraderie filled the air. Karen's future on the HOA board looked grim. An emergency session was called to discuss the misuse of her authority and her pattern of filing unsubstantiated complaints. Several residents, emboldened by the success of this showdown, stepped forward to testify about her past bullying. Many long-ignored infractions and questionable fines were officially nullified. As for my basketball court, it became a symbol of the neighborhood's victory over intimidation. Friends and family would drop by for a friendly game now and then, enjoying a space once targeted by unjust scrutiny. While I didn't make it a public amenity, I certainly had no issues inviting polite neighbors who asked kindly to shoot a few hoops. Reflecting on this chapter, I realized how easily a power-tripping HOA member can manipulate rules to control others. Yet, standing up for our rights, armed with evidence, united in purpose, proved that even the most intimidating figures can be held accountable. If you found this story compelling or relate to experiences with overbearing HOAs, please like, share, and subscribe. Together, we can continue shining a light on abuses of power and remind everyone, your home should be your sanctuary, free from unwarranted intrusion. Subscribe to the channel and share this video if you believe in standing up to intimidation. Comment below. Have you ever dealt with a Karen or an HOA overstepping its bounds? Let's keep the conversation going.